Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Institute for Government. My name's Hannah White, and I'm Director of the Institute, and I am Chair of the Commission on the Centre of Government, which we are launching here today. So thank you very much to everyone who's joining us here in the room and everyone who is joining online. I'm delighted to be joined here on stage by Sir Anthony Selden, who is Deputy Chair of the Commission, and I'm really pleased that we're joined in the audience today by many of our excellent commissioners who will be undertaking this very exciting journey with us. I know many of our other commissioners are joining us online, and I also want to say that we have some other commissioners in the pipeline who we will be announcing in coming days, who will enhance the diversity of the Commission in various ways, so look out for them. A couple of logistical points before we start. We'll be tweeting this event from IFG Events using the hashtag IFG Centre, so do tweet along if you feel like it. And if you are either here in the room or at home, please do start sending in your questions via Slido. You can also use Slido to send your thoughts on the Commission and who we should be talking to and what questions we should be asking. We're very keen to hear everyone's thoughts on that. Just to let you know a little bit about how we're going to run the event today, I'm going to kick off by telling you a little bit about the Commission. Anthony's then going to say a little bit about why we thought it was so important to run this Commission now. I'm then going to turn to our panellists, who I'm extremely pleased are joining us, Lord Butler, Peter Hill and Baroness Finn. Ask them some questions, and then we'll open up to let you all ask your questions from the floor and from online. So, to kick off the Commission, why are we doing this Commission? Well, one reason, when Anthony came to us with the idea of a Commission on the Centre of Government, one reason we were so keen is that the IFG has always had a long-standing interest in the Centre of Government, for obvious reasons, in how Number 10 operates, in how the Cabinet Office works with Number 10, and both of those relationships with the Treasury. We've published reports on how the Centre is organised, most notably Centre Forward, which was authored by Jill Rutter. We've looked at the confusion of accountabilities we feel there is at the centre of government sometimes between politicians and civil servants, culminating in a report by my colleague Alex Thomas, who's here in the front, last summer, who wrote about an idea we have for whether we could put the civil service on a better statutory footing in order to clarify those accountabilities. And we've talked over the course of the IFG's existence to numerous people, like those on stage today, who've worked at the centre, politicians, special advisors and civil servants. So the opportunity to focus on this question of why the centre does and doesn't work was really attractive to us. The opportunity to do it with a wise and experienced set of commissioners who would expand our horizons, provoke us, make us ask different questions to the ones the IFG might naturally ask itself, really was irresistible. And we're really keen and pleased that we've managed to recruit a set of commissioners who aren't just people who've worked at the centre all their lives, but who have interacted with the centre, who have thought interestingly about other sectors, indeed internationally, how other centres of government work, and can bring those ideas and that real questioning perspective to everything that we do. And the prospect of running this Commission over a year, as we're going to do, at a time when we've got a new government, which is seeking to make its mark, as it may have just done with the Windsor framework, and an opposition contemplating what it might be like to be in government, was, again, very attractive to us, because we feel there's a real opportunity for this Commission to have impact. And by impact, we don't just mean in the short term, over the next 5 years, but really over the next 30 years of thinking what could the centre of government be and how could it better serve the UK. We're going to be taking evidence from people who've worked at the centre, but also people from a whole range of other spheres, including those who have interacted with the centre. I hasten to add that it's not possible for our excellent group of commissioners to represent every possible viewpoint themselves, so that's why we're so keen to ensure that we get everyone's ideas on who we should be talking to. We'll be looking at evidence of when the centre has worked best over the last 100 years or so. We'll be looking at evidence internationally, and we'll be looking at evidence and experience from other sectors, including, of course, local government and devolved government in the UK, one of our closest comparators. So that's why we really think this is a great opportunity. We're really pleased at the IFG to be launching this commission. And I'm going to hand over to Anthony to say a few words now about why he thinks it's so important for us to be doing it right now.
Thank you very much, Hannah, and a very warm welcome to everybody here in this room and next door, and welcome to everybody online. Thank you very much for joining us and giving us that support at our very outset. It means a lot to us. In my 5 minutes, I'm going to just say a word about why now, how, and I'm going to finish with one provocation. Can I just mention by name the commissioners who are here? There are many watching online, but those who are here, just so that you have the opportunity over coffee, if you can stay on, to say hello to them. Commissioners present are Lord Darcy, Richard Lambert, Lawrence Freedman, Karen von Hippel, Mark Thompson, Ben Warner, Matthew Juniper, and Anne McElvoy. So they are here, those 8.
And Ian Mulhern over there.
And thank you so much. They're there, that idea of talking to us, helping us. If we're going to make a success of this, we're going to do it together. There's vast wisdom in these 2 rooms. There's vast wisdom online. So why? Well, it's nearly 40 years since Robin Butler was a very young man in the Treasury at the time, since Peter Hennessy and I set up our institute to try and get more interchange between those in government and those studying it. And over those 40 years, the quality of leadership, premiership, decision-making has not significantly improved at all, and we've had a number of troubled premierships in a row, and the time is ripe. And as Hannah said, all that I did was just the catalyst for an idea that was bubbling up, the work that Jill Rutter and many others have been doing here at the Institute for Government. It was simply the right time. That's why. And why now? Well, we could spend 10 years doing this, frankly, but we are going to do it in 1 year. Some commissions take inquiries take a long time, too long. We have to do this because there's going to be a general election likely next autumn. We're going to be having possibly a new government or the Rishi Sunak government back. This is the moment. Government cannot think itself into these types of solutions. New administrations come in, new prime ministers. It's so incredibly exciting. Prime Minister, I've got the President of the United States on the phone. Prime Minister, I've got Ed Sheeran wanting to talk to you. I've got Rupert Murdoch wanting to talk to you. I've got the palace. Oh my goodness, it's so exciting. There isn't that time to actually think. And every Prime Minister who I've ever written about has always said the one thing that they most miss, like their teams, was that thinking time. So we're going to be doing this, reporting early 2024 with a set of recommendations, very sensible and likely, and some more blue skies recommendations that all commissioners will not agree on, but which will, we believe, be sensible and enriched by your contributions. How Hannah's done that. Government, they don't really, can we whisper this softly? They don't really know how the centre works in Japan or Korea or Brasilia. They really don't. They really haven't a clue how the centre works. And government is different. Every history, every culture of every country is different, but there's some fundamentals, not the least how you use AI and digital to connect government and to stop it being so siloed. Learning from the private sector. Why is there so little learning from the private sector? Running highly complex, competitive organisations, which if they're not performing properly, will go under. Why are we not learning from the very best, highly complex private sector organisations in this country and abroad? And also, having tried for years to get talks into Number 10 so that the incumbents learn from the past, Peter Hill was incredibly supportive and helpful when he was Principal Private Secretary under Theresa May for this, getting people in so that people can enjoy and meet people like Robin Butler, who've been there before, who can have an institutional memory and wisdom. There isn't time for that, and we need to respect. So when does it work best? What can we learn from the private sector? What can we learn from abroad? Finally, a provocation. Look, this is very provocative, but prime ministers come in, and one thing they know is that the previous regime was rubbish, particularly if it's in their own party. They don't know anything at all. We've got to get rid of them. They're stained people. And what they end up doing is reverting to type. So Tony Blair lost so much time because he came into number 10 and was leader of the opposition for his first substantially 4 years when he had the most political capital. Gordon Brown came in, he was the Treasury Prime Minister. Theresa May came in early on and was the Home Office Prime Minister. Boris Johnson, in his early years before Simon sorted him out, was the City Hall Prime Minister. And Rishi Sunak has the risk of being the Treasury Prime Minister. Why? Because there's not time, unlike that American system, with 8 weeks to think it through. Suddenly they're there. We are there to be their thinking minds to help them. We're in this. We are there, whichever government, we don't care who wins the general election, we are there to help, and we'll help better with all of you helping us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anthony. So I'd like to turn now to our excellent panel, who've been waiting very patiently for us, and introduce them quickly, and then I'll ask some questions. So Lord Butler, of course, following a long career in the civil service, was Private Secretary to Edward Heath and Harold Wilson, Principal Private Secretary to Margaret Thatcher, and then, of course, Cabinet Secretary under Thatcher, Major and Blair. Simone Finn, Baroness Finn, worked as a Special Advisor at the Centre of Government in the Cabinet Office and as Deputy Chief of Staff to Boris Johnson. And Peter Hill, until very recently, was a civil servant and was Principal Private Secretary to Theresa May, and most recently CEO of COP26. So really an excellent set of people, I think, to start us off on this journey with their reflections today. Lord Butler, I'd like to start with you, if that's okay, because you really bring this tremendous experience over time of having worked for 5 different...
50 years.
and 5 different prime ministers. And I think that's really interesting for us. Can you tell us a little bit about how you think the personality and the approach of different prime ministers changes the effectiveness of the centre of government?
Yes, I mean, personalities matter, and all the prime ministers I served with were different. They had different talents, different characteristics, and when I give talks about the prime ministers, I say that none of them were duds. The media would have you think that they're all fools and knaves, and certainly that wasn't true of any of the prime ministers that I served. As you say, I mean, I was there from 1972 on and off until 1997. And actually, number 10 didn't really change much during that time. It was a slim line, very much more slim line than I gather it is today, very functional. And perhaps, I mean, I could just start it off by describing what number 10 consisted of in the time that I was there. And as I say, it really didn't change very much. There were the private secretaries in those 2 rooms next to the cabinet room facing out onto Horse Guards. Civil servants, principal private secretary who was a grade 3 civil servant, but was really the boss of the place. I mean, and it always was a he in my time, perhaps still always has been, was the person who was really the chief honcho of number 10. And then in those 2 rooms, there were 4 other private secretaries, one dealing with foreign affairs, one dealing with treasury and economic, one dealing with MPs' correspondence and parliamentary questions, and one dealing with home affairs and diary. And then there was a duty clerk in the corner who had connections to the team of duty clerks downstairs and produced all the papers we wanted. And then also down on that lower floor, there were the garden rooms and the girls who did all the typing. And then there was the other side of the cabinet room was the political secretary, Douglas Hurd when I was first there, Marcia Falkender, and then a sort of place where the parliamentary private secretary could come in and perch. And then, particularly in the later years, the policy unit, Bernard Donoghue, Sarah Hogg, which was a team of really only 7. Not all political appointments, some civil servants among them, and their job was to, as it were, inject thoughts to the Prime Minister, often from a political perspective. And then there was the appointment secretary, there was the honours section, and of course the press office, that bow window at the front, very much smaller, I gather, than it is today. And I think I've got them all. I mean, that was really it. And lines of communication were extremely short. Everybody had access to the Prime Minister as it was necessary, and they didn't have to ask permission to go and do it. And it felt like a family rather than a department. And of course, it also felt like a great privilege to be there. And so I think there was great advantage in that slim line method of correspondence. Now, remember, talking about thinking time, Harold Macmillan, I didn't quite serve under him, but he described it as the lightest job he ever had, plenty of time to read Trollope and Jane Austen. Harold Wilson, second time round, described himself as the centre half lying back who was distributing the ball to his talented ministers who were on each side of the pitch. And really, and of course, I mean, it was the Cabinet Office next door that was organising the flow of government business, meetings of the Cabinet, meetings of Cabinet committees, and doing the chairman's briefs. And it seemed as if, as I look back on it, everybody had a functional role. As I say, it was very slimline, and it wasn't that senior. Top person was a grade 3 civil servant, and it just, in my memory, seemed to work.
Thank you very much, Lord Butler. So bringing us bang up to date from that very interesting account of how it used to work, Peter, you've just very recently left government. How would you reflect on how things have changed?
Well, I think the basic structure of Number 10, at least as I knew it, between 2017 and 2019 wasn't fantastically different to the way Robin describes it. Just the numbers are different. There's quite a few more people. I think we were probably 250 odd, and about 20% of those were political appointees. And I would say of my experience of a number of departments, probably 4 or 5, including working in the European Commission, I'd say probably my most positive experience of working with the political teams was in Number 10. Because you were highly integrated, you all knew what you were doing. It's very simple, Number 10, really. I mean, it's quite hard to execute, but what you're doing is very simple. You're serving the Prime Minister. And if the Prime Minister is reasonably clear about what they're trying to do, everybody can pretty quickly fall in as to what they're doing. So actually my experience was that some of the boundaries and the suspicion and the other issues that I found in other departments between the political team and the civil servants, at least in my time in Number 10, I just didn't experience at all. It was a really effective integrated team, and I know that's sort of, it's a different balance from the world Robin describes, and I'd be very surprised if that gets unravelled. So I think one of the challenges for departments is, given the very different layout in a department where the political team is, usually much less than 1%, how do you avoid a them and us culture, and how do you get a sense that we're all on the same side and we're all trying to do the same thing? And if you've got a Secretary of State who's communicating the idea that we're part of one team and everyone has different functions, that will work. If you have a Secretary of State who thinks the machine is a bit useless and needs to be kicked in order to deliver, then that will feed through to the relationship between the political team and the staff. So I think how that's managed and led is absolutely critical to whether the relationship works. And as I say, my most positive experience was of that was in number 10, and I'm hoping that was also true in Simone's time as well.
I was going to come to Simone next and put to you a quote that we had from Jonathan Powell when he was talking to us in 2020, when he said, what I discovered in number 10 was how little power you have. Was that your experience?
In a way, yes. It's the levers of power. I would totally endorse what Peter has said, and the structure hasn't massively changed, but but the numbers have changed enormously, and I don't think that's necessarily made it more effective. My observations would be that the political and the civil service teams were very well integrated in number 10, far better than in previous departments where I've worked, which is probably, again, the fact that the numbers are greater of the political and civil servants together. But my observation would be that in terms of just the levers which you have to pull, that the centre is actually quite weak. And part of this, the UK is a bit of an outlier now, in that in all the other sort of equivalent sort of civil services in Australia or New Zealand, whatever, there's actually a Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet Office, which we don't particularly have. And I think that's because number 10 has grown massively. They're not happy with, for example, the quality of data. I think that Ben Warner is one of the commissioners, and I know that we grappled with this the whole time, that the quality of data management information wasn't that good. So you set up your expert team in number 10 to get better data, for example, over COVID, whereas in fact it needs to improve over all of government to inform all of the decisions that are being made. So I think there's always a danger to set up something really expert in number 10 and then worry less about whether or not that's filtering through to the rest of it. So just as observations, I think that the Cabinet Office has become very unwieldy now. It's gone from 2,000 people when I was there in the coalition government to 10,000 people now. I think there are quite serious questions that need to be asked, and I don't think it's massively controversial that the teams that in the Cabinet Office that support the Prime Minister are very simple. They're very similar to what Lord Butler was describing, in terms of there's the Cabinet Secretary, there are the Secretariats, there's the NSA, that those could maybe be hived off, the Honours Secretariat, to support the direct support for the Prime Minister, and then to look at the functions, and I'm talking about the corporate, horizontal, cross-cutting functions of government, which everyone seems to have thought were not a bad idea because they've kept them, but I don't think they're necessarily functioning as well as they should any longer, or at least the mandates need to be improved. And I think there's possibly an argument now for the separation of the sort of the functions becoming a sort of corporate headquarters of government, to run the implementation, that cabinet committees are supported by these functions, and then you have to get into the really knotty territory, which nobody wants to talk about, well, they do want to talk about it, but nothing's ever resolved, which is the levers in number 10 a week, because we don't address the supreme power of the Treasury. And I always felt that the Prime Minister didn't have the equivalent support in being able to do the bilaterals with the Chancellor, because there wasn't that sort of strong advice there. And I think there is possibly an argument now to think about that the functions include the finance function, which is in the Treasury at the moment. David Sainsbury did a very good review in the coalition time. And I think there's something to be said that the finance function, which means the budget allocation, how the money is spent, how it is allocated, should possibly be sitting now properly with the rest of the functions to get a real-time support to the Prime Minister in implementing the policies. And there will be problems with that, with how do you cut across the cross-departmental relationships, the relationships with the Secretaries of State, how do you use the Cabinet committees and that structure to support it through a civil service board, etc. And the really thorny problem of the leadership, because everyone I speak to say there isn't leadership of all of the, there's not one person in charge, and I think that's especially of these functions and the implementation. So I think that's something that needs to be looked at.
Very good. Lots of very common IFG themes there. We're also big fans of the functional system. Anthony, you wanted to come in.
Just wanted to introduce Karen von Hippel and Mark Thompson, who are commissioners who are there for you to chat to later. Two quick things, Hannah, that amongst the many things that the panellists have mentioned that we're also going to be looking at. One is this issue of trust. Why has the centre grown without any monitoring? Up to 10,000 in the Cabinet Office, huge numbers in number 10. People can't even count that high, the numbers in number 10, without any rational evaluation of what's happening. It just grows and there's money to pay for them. It's because there's lack of trust. Ask any Prime Minister's team why the centre grows. It's because we don't trust Cabinet Ministers to do the jobs properly. The erosion of trust is a very, very real factor, and it's one that we need to look at, and it goes with leaking. I remember Robin Butler telling me 30 years ago, there's no point in anyone saying anything you did say this, Robin, by the way, of value in Cabinet, because it will be in the first edition of the Evening Standard by lunchtime. So can we address...
John Major's government.
Can we address... It was, but let's keep it between us because it was dead secret. And the second thing is the long term, a point that Jeremy Hayward was particularly keen on. Who is thinking? Think of all the long-term issues that have not been addressed by these incoming governments that try and reinvent the wheel every time, not looking at institutional knowledge, not looking at what works best, and the long-term issues, social care, energy security, AI, on education, health, they just accumulate, and they're not being looked at. So that's just two other factors that we'll be looking at.
Rob Butler, can I ask you to respond to a couple of things that Baroness Finn said? One about the relationship with the Treasury. Obviously, you worked in the Treasury as well as at the centre, so I'd be interested in your reflections on the evolution of how that has worked. But also these questions about leadership, the leadership that the Cabinet Secretary has to provide, both of the civil service and as the key advisor to the Prime Minister.
Well, I mean, it is a fault line in our government, definitely, between the Prime Minister and the Chancellor of the Exchequer. You know, ironically, the Prime Minister is the First Lord of the Treasury. Margaret Thatcher always tried to, in dealing with her Chancellors, always tried to emphasise that. But it's certainly true that, of course, if there is a difference that emerges, and a difference emerged between Margaret Thatcher and Nigel Lawson, then the Prime Minister is outgunned. And so, you know, as in so many things, everything depends on those two being in lockstep. If they get separated, then the Prime Minister hasn't got the guns to prevail. But that's just one of those things that, you know, you've got to find somebody you can work with, and for the most part. Well, it often doesn't happen. I mean, Tony Blair and Gordon Brown is another example. So you really don't want the Prime Minister and Chancellor being out of step with each other. Now, on leadership, I'm very uneasy about how things are now. In the number 10 that I worked in, there was no doubt within number 10 where the leadership came from. Leadership came from the Principal Private Secretary, Robert Armstrong, who was a strong personality, and everybody was happy with that leadership. What role did the Cabinet Secretary play? Well, within number 10, really not very much. And I found, when I came back as Cabinet Secretary in '88, I was definitely the other side of the green baize door. So I felt my responsibility was to make the machinery of government work, and then, of course, the responsibility as head of the civil service, and and I had next steps and all that. So there was plenty of opportunity for leadership. I gave up some of the roles that the Cabinet Secretary had before, like being the Sherpa for the G7, really to concentrate on the civil service. So that was where I tried to direct my efforts at leadership.
And when you say you feel uneasy about where we are now, what do you think has changed?
Well, I'm afraid I think that it is unclear whether the leadership of number 10 is in the hands of the civil servant, the principal private secretary, or in the hands of the political appointees, and particularly the Chief of Staff, who actually the one thing, as I understand it, the Chief of Staff isn't, is a Chief of Staff, but is obviously very close to the Prime Minister. And I would say this, wouldn't I? But I think that, the civil service does know the machine, makes the machine work. And if people who are political appointees have got the ambition of politicians and really haven't got much experience, have too much influence over the Prime Minister, things don't get properly thought out, and you see damage to policy.
I think I should let you respond to that one.
No, I think Lord Butler makes a fair point. I mean, the Chief of Staff isn't the Chief of Staff because under CRAG, political appointees, special advisors, are not allowed to manage or direct civil servants. And there is, obviously there is a fear that there's too much influence in the hands of unelected, non-political individuals, or not unelected individuals, should we say, who are political. I think that I think when I was talking about the leadership, I think number 10 has become a lot bigger, as Peter said. So it's to have one PPS who's giving the policy advice in a private office capacity to the Prime Minister, plus trying to sort of manage quite a lot of other functions that are in number 10 is quite a tall order. I think that to go to the Chief of Staff position, it's quite an important one. The best position, the best way of squaring the circle would actually be to have, because we had Steve Barclay as Chief of Staff, who was, a sort of cabinet minister. I would give the Chief of Staff position cabinet rank. I don't know that it necessarily works being drawn from but certainly a ministerial rank. And because then there's an accountability that they have to have, which is quite important. And that possibly drawn from the House of Lords, because there was definitely a disquiet about someone being drawn from the House of Commons. So I think that's one way of ensuring greater accountability. What I was talking about in terms of the leadership, because Prime Ministers do moan about the lack of implementation, the lack of cross-departmental support, which is why we end up setting up delivery units, etc., in number 10, to see the cross, the sort of like the drugs ideas or the net zero approach, to find those cross-departmental issues. And so one of the recommendations from the Smarter Government Commission was to have implementation plans underneath all the cabinet committees. It's not a bad idea, but what I'm really talking about is the leadership of who's actually in charge of the implementation of policy, which is ahead of the civil service role, or more so than the cabinet secretary, who's supposed to be providing the sort of policy advice and managing the secretariats, and possibly more of a number 10 prime ministerial person, which is why I'd be very interested in Lord Butler's view on that separation, because I think that the two are rather different roles, the head of the civil service and the cabinet secretary, and there's very rarely a separate head of the civil service.
don't know if you want to come in
Can
on
I just
that.
very quickly answer that? It was an issue when I was retiring and Tony Blair was thinking of dividing them. And the argument I had was that if you are also head of the civil service and cabinet secretary, you have that gives you leverage over the permanent secretaries. The permanent secretaries care about your influence over their careers. And so I found that did give me heft with the other permanent secretaries, and you can use that to the Prime Minister's advantage in getting things done in departments.
A couple of points. So I mean, I have more sympathy with the idea that number 10 needs a decent number of people, because when things go wrong, they end up on the Prime Minister's desk. So one way or the other, you will be accountable as the Prime Minister for all the other things that might go wrong in your government, and you need some way of covering that. The challenge is to balance that with actually focusing on the things that really matter, and to be able to do that over the course of several years, because that's how long it takes to effect change. So that's the constant tension in the building, is how do I cover everything, or appear to cover everything, while really focusing on the things that are going to make a difference to the country and to my premiership. In terms of the building, I mean, I think the leadership of the building has got to come from within the building. It can't really come from anywhere else. And I don't think there is a world in which you don't have both a civil service dimension and a political dimension. And the key to an effective building is that those two things work in harmony. And the people at the top of the operation understand each other and work together really well. And the building doesn't see a fag paper between them. Now, it's easier said than done. But that, to me, I don't see an alternative to that, because I don't see a world in which either of those legs is going to be either subsumed by the other, taken away, or diminished. So, and I shouldn't extrapolate from my own experience, but that was my experience. It's absolutely key that I, as the PPS, the DG of Downing Street, and the Chief of Staff worked hand in glove. Where we had differences, we sorted them out quickly, and the building got a solid message about what together we were doing, rather than, well, he says this and they say that, and this bit of number 10 thinks that, and another bit of, and you end up with the competing courts, which is a nightmare for effective government.
Great. We're going to turn over now to some questions. I'll take some questions in the room. I've also got lots of questions coming in online. So we've got a roving mic. Please wait for it to come to you, and then tell us who you are, if that's okay. So, Alex, if we start with the gentleman here.
Hannah, my name's Andrew. How very kind of you to ask me to speak. So just to ask the panel, should we really go to the United States method? Let's just appoint everybody to the top 100 jobs as a political appointment, and when the Prime Minister leaves, they go as well.
Thank you. We're going to take questions in groups of 3, I think. So there's a gentleman at the back there.
Just in Josh Arnold Forster, I was a SPAD at a spending department and was familiar with the concerns that has been expressed about the Treasury, but I had a bit of sympathy with them in that the department I was involved with had a culture of trying to second guess what the Treasury would try and do. But nevertheless, there is still no real way to hold the Treasury to account for some of the, not just the funding decisions, but decisions about competition and the obsession with competition, or the CDEL-RDEL split, or all of these other things that the Treasury have consistently argued for over the last 40 years. There was that famous quote, "We are all monetarists now." Well, really, are we? And particularly, do we really support globalisation? Which bit of government is actually looking at how we change that framework?
And Alex, we come to this gentleman who's popped through from next door, which I can encourage other people next door to also do.
Thank you so much. My name is Aaron Boove. I used to be grade 6 in the Home Office and in and out of government, started as a fast stream and an apprentice. One of the things I guess I'm recognising, we're talking a lot about individuals and appointments, but we're not talking about processes and governance in terms of constitution. Is that something that we're missing in the UK, a written constitution to protect the processes that we have fought up to this point in time have been the safeguards that we need?
Okay, who would like to kick off on those questions? Peter?
Well, I have a crack at a couple of them. I mean, on the Treasury, Look, I mean, pragmatically, I think many governments have gone through this. Do we need another super ministry of economy? And I'm sure that will be one of the things that you consider. I just note that consistently that's not been where we end up. Now, maybe that's going to change, I don't know, but personally that would surprise me. I don't think that basic lay down of departments and the role of the Treasury is likely to fundamentally change. I do think that, and as Lord Butler says, the Treasury will always have the whip hand because it has 2,000 very bright civil servants. And quantity has its own quality as well. And in a confrontation or disagreement with Number 10, they will weigh heavily. I do think that having a serious, capable economics team in Number 10 is important, because I think there needs to be some capability within the building to provide advice, input, thought, challenge to the Prime Minister. And that doesn't have to be always a conflictual relationship with the Treasury. I think it can be quite a creative one. On the US system of appointments, I guess the problem is picking and mixing bits from different systems always needs a bit of thought, because the system as a whole functions in a particular way, and if you take bits out without the checks and balances that are elsewhere, then you just need to think about what you're left with. I do have a lot of, both on my experience on COP and elsewhere, I do have a lot of sympathy with the idea that the government could find ways of getting expertise from outside into government more often, more consistently, and at greater scale. I certainly, when I was working on COP, I think probably 10-15% of my team were from outside government. And for reasons that I won't bore you with, it was enormously valuable. These are people who not only bring expertise, drive, commitment, they're also networked in a way that when you're within government, you don't quite realise what really deep networking means. So, and there's all sorts of issues with that, and I understand the challenges, but I have quite a lot of sympathy with the idea that in a complex, dynamic, disrupted, all the other things world, trying to bring that expertise in could be made easier and could be more of a standing part of how we do business. But moving to an appointment system for all of the top of government, I'm not so sure, unless you're going to do quite a lot of other things differently in government as well.
Well, I can see pretty well that my only difference with Peter is that I'm a small staff man and he's a large staff man. But on this question of providing expertise to the Prime Minister, I recall that Margaret Thatcher had Alan Walters, which worked very well first time. Ted Heath had Brian Redding. These were sort of, as it were, one guru. Margaret Thatcher had Tony Parsons as the Foreign Affairs advisor. And my feeling was this worked as long as that person was a bridge to the department and not an obstacle to the department. And all those, including Alan Walters' first time round, really were bridges. They interpreted the department to the Prime Minister and the Prime Minister to the department. And that needs doing. It's a very valuable role. But it doesn't need to be a big function, in my view.
Thank you.
So my view, on the political appointments, I'm sort of going to come down on the side very much of retaining the permanent, impartial, politically impartial civil service, because I think that the institutional memory is important. The continuity is important. Asking why things didn't work the first time, we don't ask it enough, but it's quite an important part. That's not to say there shouldn't be sort of new ways of looking at things. We need to have the flexibility. The accountability lines could be a bit difficult. In a private office, a private sector, the PPS has a dual line of accountabilities, both to their minister, but also to their permanent secretary, who decides pay and rations, which is always quite an important part of anyone's calculation. So I think it's important to work out how you manage that sort of accountability. I think we introduced a few things during the coalition, such as a fixed tenure for permanent secretaries, which sharpens accountability doesn't always, there have been criticisms of it, but it isn't quite an important way of ensuring that the system as it works correctly from an accountability level. We need to have better ability to bring in the skills that are lacking, and it goes to this stewardship point of the civil service. Who's making sure that we do have the project management skills, the digital skills, the management information skills, the commercial skills that are sort of increasingly in demand. When we were in the coalition, we introduced something called, and Peter might be able to help me here, the extended ministerial office, so that the political teams, and it was easier to bring in a mixture of political and civil servant teams, so that ministers felt that they had that more direct support. But for some reason that was scrapped when Theresa came in, so I've never quite understood why. And to go to the point about the Constitution, I know that the Institute has been keen to recommend that there's a possible move to a statutory basis. I would actually oppose that on the grounds that I don't think it's a good idea to set the civil service in conflict with the elected Prime Minister, and I think there's a fault line. But we do need to, and one of the things that your Commission will probably be looking at carefully is how you balance that proper stewardship long-term of the civil service to make sure it's the skills, etc., kept up to date to carry on serving ministers.
Thank you. And I would say, this is probably a debate we should have separately, but I don't think we see it as setting up the civil service in opposition to the Prime Minister and the politics. It's about clearly defining what.
But there is a danger, if you follow the rule through properly, that a Prime Minister who is accountable in Parliament might possibly be up against a sort of a statute in Parliament.
I don't say.
But anyway, it's just...
I want to take a couple of questions we've had coming in online. So Ben Yong from Durham University asked a very interesting question. Are there certain minimum requirements to the centre that should exist regardless of who is Prime Minister? I think he's getting at the sort of the structures at the centre. Are we too flexible? And the other question I wanted to take was, it's disappeared. There's a question about the role of the centre in this is from Sam Chivers, the role of the centre in generating sort of trust and capability. So he or she says, are the problems at the centre a result of living in and responding to an increasingly complicated world? And should the goal be to clarify the function of the centre so that people understand what it's there for? And I think that this is a really interesting question. Are we all talking about the centre wanting, and having the same concept of what the centre should be for? Who would like to take those two? Why don't you each take one? Don't feel you need to answer them all.
Well, yeah, I think I have a more minimal concept of the role of the centre. In our constitution, we shouldn't be completely bound by history, but all statutory powers are conferred on secretaries of state. The Prime Minister has no effective statutory powers at all. And so, that I think produced the concept that the Prime Minister was the chair of the Cabinet, but as it were, the heavy lifting was done by all the departments. Now, as Peter said, and I think it's definitely more the case now, in the end, the buck always stops with the Prime Minister. And you've got to have an arrangement that deals with that. And I think that is more true now than it was in my day. But as I say, I always felt that the role of the centre was not to get in the way of the departments, to keep them up to the mark, but not to try to do their job for them.
Peter?
I think Lord Butler is absolutely right. In fact, the delegation of authority, as I understood it, because we went through this, but we were looking at the extended ministerial offices. The Prime Minister is the Minister for the Civil Service, and as such, he delegates authority to the Secretaries of State in department. Now, then there's this nice construct that the Secretary of State then delegates the Permanent Secretary to manage the department. But in terms of letting your Secretaries of State get on with it, I think is actually terribly important. But how do you then coordinate it properly from the centre? And I think that's actually the key question of how much support do you want at the centre, that you're developing policy at the centre and then you're handing out to your Secretary of States maybe an implementation of that policy and the detailed policy implementation. How much are you actually going to be reliant on your Secretary of States and their departments for that policy advice? And I think that's the sort of existential question that needs to be answered.
I just wonder, before we finish in 5 minutes, whether any of the commissioners want to say anything themselves, and if so, they're mostly in the front row here. They've got that.
I wanted to also welcome Matthew Juniper, who's snuck in and not had a name check so far.
Welcome. And there was a lady here who was very keen on a question too. And this. Do we have time for?
Yeah, we've got, I think, time for a very quick final round of three questions. So, gentleman here, and then.
Adam Ridley, one-time special advisor to the Chancellor, Mrs. Thatcher, prepared a few manifestos like the 79 one. I've got two questions for Anthony and Robin. In mentioning the arrival of incompetent and ignorant ministers in power, I think you didn't make any implicit reference even to preparation for government. One of the things one did between 74 and 79 was to actually prepare for government. And that involved a great deal of work, and to the extent that the civil service permitted it, which was minimal, a fair amount
of... Civil service omitted it?
I say to the extent that the civil service permitted it, a certain amount of constructive discussion in the undergrowth, which Robin may remember. Okay. My other question is particularly directed to Robin, which is the longer term. You will be thinking about the longer term, but I'm wondering if he could reflect, and you could reflect, on what it is that makes us so bad at thinking about the longer term. I say it as another member of the Central Policy Review staff, late lamented.
Thank you. Was the lady?
Margaret Aldred, former civil servant. I really wanted to ask a question which both Robin and Simone touched on in their last answer, which is about the relationship between the Prime Minister and the Secretaries of State, because in my experience, that is one of the fundamental things to getting things done. And Number 10 and the Cabinet Office have grown because they bring problems in that they see they want to sort, and they're not being sorted. But I think I differ a little from Simone, because I think Secretary of States do have statutory powers, which are enshrined in things like the Defence Powers Act. And the way in which the Prime Minister can and can't work with their cabinet is actually fundamental to the way the central government works. And at the core of government, the relationship between the Cabinet Office, the Treasury, and Number 10 is the thing which will determine whether it has the power to get the levers to work. And that's often by sort of personality and sheer force of will. And I'd be interested in the panel's comments on that.
And do we have one other question from next door? Am I getting that sense, or is that... No. Okay, sorry. There is... Mustn't neglect our neighbours next door.
Thank you. My name's Sammy. I'm the current civil servant at the Ministry of Justice. I'm wondering whether you could briefly reflect on, it strikes me that disagreements over kind of exactly the role of the centre and how command and control it should be versus how kind of delegated it should be is kind of a microcosm for broader debates that normally take place at the political level about the same question. To what extent should we be, should government be, to what extent should the state be calling the shots, to what extent should we be devolving powers to other people? So my question is, should we expect that to basically fluctuate as political parties fluctuate and as kind of the powers in government change depending on their views? Thanks.
Brilliant. So as we are running up against time, I'm going to ask each of the panellists to pick any of those they wish to answer and any final concluding remarks they'd like to make before we come to an end. So
I would only say, I mean, yes, you're absolutely right about the relationship between the Prime Minister and Secretaries of State, and we haven't touched on that. I think that if we could make the Prime Minister should obviously be setting the centralised direction. The Prime Minister is the one who gives the appointment. It's their patronage. It's one of their few great levers of power to a Secretary of State, and I think there needs to be a common discussion about what is to be achieved. How that's achieved, I think there needs to be the confidence that it's capable of being delivered and that it shouldn't be micromanaged from number 10. I always thought Margaret Thatcher had a rather more decentralised approach of getting good people in place to get on with what they were meant to be doing, and that is how it should work. But there does need to be that bond of trust that it works through maybe common policies through cabinet committees, and that the implementation is there, and that it can happen, that you have the support in your department, and that you've got the support and the good relationship with number 10 to manage that.
Peter.
2 or 3 remarks. So, I mean, it's the politics stupid, right? I mean, to put it bluntly, one can mess around with the centre a lot, but the political context is going to determine what parameters you're operating in. So where you are in the Parliament, what the size of your majority is, what the nature of your majority is, how stable your majority is, what the world is hitting you with. All those are the parameters which determine how the centre functions as much as more than where the chairs are. As you say, the Prime Minister has the pulpit and patronage. I mean, the rest is sort of secondary. Those are the things you have. The tension, I think, that you're identifying, and I'm sure you'll look through, is essentially a centre that's designed to service effective cabinet government, with all the other pressures which are privileging a more presidential style of government. And, you know, that's not a new tension, that's a familiar one. I don't see a way around that, but that the centre gives the appearance of taking an interest in everything, because as Robin has said, it lands on your desk, plus you need to keep departments sort of honest, without trying to micromanage, except for those 2 or 3 things where you've really decided you're going to stick with it and put your shoulder to the wheel over the course of 5 years, because those are decisive for the country or for the government or whatever. I don't see myself a way of reconciling the tensions between the cabinet system that we've got and the pressures towards a prime ministerial presidential system that we've also got, other than finding that balance which will shift between breadth and focus.
Very interesting. Lord Butler?
I just like to take Adam's 2 points. We do, of course, have the convention, very valuable, that prime ministers authorise 15 months before an election. I mean, 15 months in case the incumbent calls an election before the last moment, where there can be discussions between permanent secretaries and opposition leaders. And those are very valuable, and I think preparation of that sort between the civil service, done on a confidential basis with the opposition, is extremely valuable, not least to stop them preparing in quite the wrong ways. You know, I always think that as an example of that was the reform of the health service of Andrew Lansley in 2010, which didn't have nearly enough influence from the Department of Health and was actually contained some very important mistakes. The other thing is thinking for the long term. It's, you know, I mean, it's the immediate pressures on prime ministers and governments. The CPRS was asked to introduce a long-term aspect to government, and we tried to do that. I always think, and I think of William Hague's column in the Times yesterday, a good prime minister will have policy intentions on 2 levels. One is to deal with the day-to-day, but underlying it, a mission that he doesn't make much of, but is always in the Prime Minister's mind, and preferably in the minds of the Cabinet, which isn't much advertised to the press, but which really drives the government. And I think several of the Prime Ministers that I worked for did have that underlying mission, and when they did, they were more successful.
Thank you very much. Anthony?
You always know when Robin goes slightly quieter that there's going to be something even more revealing coming up there. Look, I think that's really interesting. I just want to just bring a couple of strands together, but just by dipping back into the past. halfway through the Cabinet Secretary's life, and he created the Cabinet Office in 1916. The fourth Cabinet Secretary, Robin Butler's predecessor, said, we can't cope, it's too complex. I remember him saying this, it is simply, you do not understand, government is simply too complex. All I can do is if I've got 3 balls, I can throw them all up and I'll just, with luck, catch one. Now, is that really right? I mean, he was talking halfway back. Is it really right that government is complex? That's more complex. That's one of the things we're going to be looking at. And how can we use digital? We've got amazing people like Ben Warner and Aradazi and the whole commissioners there who really understand Matthew Juniper, the digital. How can we use digital to make the complex easier to understand? Would be one thought, which we welcome your ideas on, and also the question of this Treasury that keeps coming up. I mean, is a solution to go back halfway through the life of the Cabinet Secretary, halfway through the life of the Prime Minister? The Prime Minister was First Lord of the Treasury and Chancellor of the Exchequer. Gladstone revoked what Peel had done, and Peel was Chancellor himself, decided not to do it and get rid of the Treasury. How can we sort that out? What can we learn from abroad about heads of government and that inevitable conflict that can be well managed with the Chancellor? So, look, that was great. We are just setting out on a journey. 15 months, Robin reminded us, is the time that now we're going to be looking ahead, that the civil service can start talking to different political parties. We are very much in this. The extent to which we succeed in coming up with something that nobody has done for many years, which is to produce sensible proposals, rational proposals, digging into the private sector, digging into the past, digging into foreign governments. What can we learn that all governments will implement for the benefit of everybody, and including sorting out the long-term problems? The extent that the Institute will do that will be with your goodwill and your ideas, and we welcome it. And thank you very much online and being here in person. Hannah.
Thank you, Anthony. Well, I think that just about sums it up. Thank you all so much for joining us here today. And as I say, look out for further events as we progress our thinking and take evidence and hopefully come up with some really interesting conclusions around this time next year. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Robin. Thoroughly enjoyed it.